Chapter 2. Two Voices Call. Do you remember that day in November? Long, long ago, long ago? Old song. Who'll grow the bread of victory? Who'll keep the country clean? Who'll reap old England golden? Who'll sow her thick and green? Carry on, for the men and boys are gone, but the furrow shan't lie, follow, while the women carry on. The signature of the letter was yours, Richard Wynne. Now, who in the world might he be? Richard Wynne? Wynne? Suddenly I realized why the surname at least was familiar. Mr. Wynne, of course. I placed him now. I did remember. Sitting there one on this the most miserable morning of my life, my thoughts were switched back just 7 years. 7 mortal years ago, a gap between a disillusioned young woman of 22 and a gawky, eager child of 15, as I then was. That had been in the days when we lived on the borders of Wales. My father had farmed, in a scrambling sort of way, the small estate that he owned there, and as he had to make ends meet somehow, he had taken an Eterio of Hubble toys as farm pupils. What they'd learned from dear old dad's antiquated methods, goodness only knows. Mr. Wynne was the eldest of these pupils. I don't think I'd ever taken as much interest in him as I had in the fox terrier puppy that he gave me just before he sailed for the ranch of an uncle in Canada. But I had hated his going away. I always did hate partings, even from the succession of mountain-bred cooks who stayed there 6 months with us on that gloomy autumn morning, with the mountains blotted out by mist and the rain coming down in a steady drip, drip, drip on the slate roof, when we had all gathered in a veranda to say goodbye to the departing pupil. I had suddenly felt like bursting into tears. Mr. Wynne, the leggy, dark-haired Welsh lad of 19, had turned with his brand new suitcase, all ready, labeled in his hand, had seen my blank look, had stared down upon me, and had clutched me by the pigtail as I turned to flee. Nice kid, ripping kid, he muttered in a brusque, touched young voice. Give us a kiss for goodbye, Joan. And he'd drawn my head back by its plait and kissed me under the eyes of my amused family. They had ragged me about it for months. How should I, at that age, have guessed the difference between that and a real kiss? Years later, Harry had slipped the real kisses into my life in the course of conversation, so to speak, and by imperceptible degrees, which was Harry's insidious way of making love none the less fatal. Now, on the very day when love had left me in a way so very far from being imperceptible, here was this reminder from the other, forgotten young man that went on. Plenty of things happened since we said goodbye, but I've often wondered what becomes of the pretty kid with the thick brown pigtail. You'd a blue bow on it that day, and you'd never notice that I walked off with that. I suppose there's just an off chance that you are not married yet, are you? If you aren't, would you care to marry me? I gasped as I came to this. Who wouldn't have been petrified? Would you care to marry me? But how? How fantastic! At breakfast time, upon this very day, I had conveyed to me the devastating news that one young man on whom my thoughts had hung wished to see no more of me. Now, at midday, here was shock. Number two, another young man of whom I hadn't thought since I was grown up, was actually proposing to me. Both on one day. Was I living in some wild dream of coincidences? But no. The hairy wound went on aching steadily beyond this flesh in the pan, even as I read on. It sounds mad, I know. The writer actually admitted it. I'd explain details and things better if I saw you. May I come and see you? If so, please write to me here. or I shall be for the next 10 days. I could get over to your father's place. This needn't commit you to anything, but if it is all off, don't write. If I don't hear from you within a week, I shall know it was goodbye for good. Yours, Richard Wynne. Stupefied, I sat staring at his letter. Now, a proposal of marriage from almost any young man in this world would bring its special thrill to almost any girl. This, quite apart from whether she accepts it or refuses. Isn't that true, girls? So it shows what a stupor of despair I was in that morning when I tell you that only for a fleeting moment did I forget my troubles in the excitement of this Mr. Wynn's letter. I sighed as I got up, feeling a little dizzy from my perch on the National Gallery steps, for St. Mary's Church clock showed 1:30, and it was time I started walking slowly back to the revolting office. I'd had no lunch, but lunchtime would be considered over by the time I had crawled down Whitehall again. Heavens, how I hated Whitehall and wished that I never need set eyes upon. Here the quite wild idea sprang into my mind. What about this way out of it? What if this were what I was longing for? The chance of a completely new life, something to whisk me right away out of everything that I knew in the days of Harry. Here's this Mr. Richard Wynne, who was quite a nice young man. If I could only remember his face a little bit more distinctly, asking to marry me. What if I said yes? Since I was not to marry Harry, what did it matter what sort of man I did marry? But what was he like? Frowning, I tried to remember. Dark, tall, Norfolk jacket, loved dogs. That was as far as I got. Not a detail of his face could I recall. An unawakened girl child as I was 7 years ago takes scant notice of masculine faces. All she thinks of them is how ugly they are. How very unlike the people in the books that the beautiful ladies are always falling in love with. And that's the summing up of it for her. Until she's 17 or so, unless she's of the type of my little chum Elizabeth, who at 21 continued to hold this view. But what about this Richard Wynne, who at 19 had seemed a century older than I? Nowadays, I should not consider as a grown up man that youth who devoured such plateful of cold mutton and bread and cheese at my father's table. I wondered listlessly how he'd grown up. Quite cold bloodedly, for remember what I was going through. I began to debate whether I'd say I would see him. It might be better than the office, better than living exactly the same life day after day without Harry. And Harry would hear if I got engaged. How many engagements, I wonder, are entered into the mood in which I was at that darkest of moments? I thought, if I write, then my thoughts were broken into by something very different. I'd already noticed, while only half seeing it, that a little crowd had collected down in Trafalgar Square, about the spot where the tank bank stood in the spring. A crowd composed of colonial soldiers, of bare-headed factory girls from Charing Cross Road, of girl clerks from the countless government offices round about. Without much interest, I glanced over the stone coping. Above the heads of the thickening crowd, I saw a banner. It was white, with the scarlet lettered motto, England must be fed. There was a group on the small raised platform beneath it, an elderly man in a frock coat, some ladies, and a gleam of a light smoke. Someone was speaking underneath that flag. In the solitary midday air, I suddenly heard, fresh and clear, a girlish voice. These were the scraps that came to me. I appeal to you girls in this crowd. Some of you are country-born girls, like me. I'm from Wales. My county was a green county. It is now a red county. Plod up to help carry on the war. But must we look at these fields full of crops and think, these will rot in the ground because there will never be hands enough to carry them in? Ah, land army. I'd heard of this before, and now Trafalgar Square saw girls being recruited as. 3 years ago, it saw young men being asked why they were not in khaki. Then the speaker's young voice rose earnestly to my listless ears. I have put before you the disadvantages of this life: long hours, hard work, poor pay. After you get your board and lodging shilling a day, perhaps very poor pay. But girls, our boys at the front are offering their lives for just that. Won't you offer your services for that and for them? The voice attracted me, the Welsh voice that holds the secret of being clear, yet soft, with the ends of its words pronounced as crisply as by a well trained singer. It held me, that voice, while the speaker touched on the urgent need of workers to fill the places of men who had gone from farm, field, dairy, and byre. Ah, the charming picture that she made. A bright, sturdy flower of girlhood set against the parched stonework of town. She wore the land girl's uniform that sets off a woman's shape as no other custom has done yet. Under her slouch hat, her face was vividly brown and rose colored, with dark eyes alight. Her fresh, light belted smoke, with its green armlet and scarlet crown, looked cool as well as trim. The sight of her, I thought, should bring in as many recruits as the speech. She looked as if she'd never dreamed of such things as unventilated offices, typewriters that clicked mechanically all day, nervous headaches, lives sored and blighted at 22. Enviously, I glanced at her. Suddenly, was it my imagination? She looked straight back at me over the heads of the crowd. It was to me she seemed to be speaking now. You are offered some good things in this new life, girls. Good health, good sleep. Here I smiled bitterly. Good sleep. I'd had a whole fortnight of hideously broken nights. There's no sleep like that of the workers on the land, declared the recruiting land girl. Another thing you're offered is a good conscience with which to meet those lads when they return from fighting for you. Lastly, though, I don't know if it's worth mentioning really. Here her white teeth flashed in a merry smile across her rosy face. You are offered a good complexion. Then something else unexpected happened. She jumped lightly down, and it was first of all to me, that she made her way. Straight up to me she came. She looked me full in the face, smiled prettily, and in that clear voice that sounded home-like to me because my home had been where she too came from, she said, I've been watching you all the time I've been speaking. I want to say something to you. You want to speak to me? I said, surprised. I noticed you at once, said the land girl. You looked, well, not very pleased with life. Here a passer-by glanced at the contrast we made standing there, government office clerk and a land girl. She in smoke and breeches radiated rosy health. I, wearing my blue costume, Frenchy blouse, flower-wreathed hat, and a loose-heeled shoes, wilted in limpness and pallor. She said prettily, Are you in war work of any kind? Yes, I am. I work at... I gave her the rabbit warren's real name. Her bright face fell. What a pity. We're told not to try it for recruits who are engaged in other departments. I was going to ask you to join up for the land army. I should be no earthly good at that sort of thing, I assured her. Pettishly, I'm afraid. I must get back to the office. A pity, remarked the fair recruiter regretfully. Perhaps you've a friend who's not so busy. Would you pass these on? I took the leaflets she offered. Goodbye, she said. Once out of sight of that energetic young worker, I rolled her papers into a ball and tossed them into a county council waste paper bin. That is, I thought I did. My head ached so desperately that I hardly knew what I was doing by the time I got out of the glare of Whitehall and into the gloom of the office. I was before Mr. Winter, the chief who disliked me as much as he disliked open windows. Here was my chance to let in an apology for a breath of air. I tugged at the window. It was stiff. Down it came at last. But the effort had been too much for me in my rundown state. It made me feel positively sick. Then came the last straw. Suddenly, unexpectedly, Mr. Winter rasped out behind me, "Can't you keep that window shut?" I jumped violently. Think of the morning I had. I forgot myself. "Don't shout it," I began. But all in an instant, the office became dark as night. I threw out my hands, then I pitched forward in my face, knowing no more. I had fainted dead away. Half an hour later, I was sent home after Mr. Winter had leaped in his chance of telling me that I was obviously not strong enough for war work and that I need not present myself at these offices anymore. Perhaps he was scarcely justified. Perhaps he wanted to frighten me into an appeal, but I didn't say a word. I was too dazed. Sacked. Well, after that, I thought there was only one thing for me to do.